Georgie Porgy, Pudding, and Pie kissed the girls and made them cry. You have probably known that rhyme since you were a child, but the man behind it was connected to a violent end. He was stabbed through the heart in a doorway in Portsmouth in 1628. When word of his death reached London, people actually celebrated in the streets. Number 6, Goosey. Goosey Gander.
Goosey, goosey gander, where shall I wander? Upstairs, downstairs, and in my lady's chamber. There I met an old man who wouldn't say his prayers. I took him by the left leg and threw him down the stairs.
From the 1530s onward, being a Catholic priest in England could get you arrested and executed. Under Elizabeth I, it became high treason. The punishment was hanging, drawing, and quartering. And it wasn't only the priest who was in danger. Any family that hid him could receive the same punishment. Because of this, Catholic families began creating secret hiding places. They built tiny rooms behind walls, beneath floors, and inside chimneys. Some were so small that a person could barely sit inside them. Much of this work was done by a man named Nicholas Owen. He was a carpenter and a Jesuit lay brother. For years, he traveled from one Catholic house to another across England, creating hidden rooms that soldiers would struggle to find. Another Jesuit priest, John Gerard, spent years moving between these same houses. He later wrote about what happened to him. During one search, he hid inside one of Owen's hiding places for 4 days without food. He couldn't stand up. He couldn't stretch his legs. He couldn't sleep properly. The pursuivants, who were government-funded priest hunters, searched the house around him for 4 days. They ripped away plaster. They pulled down wooden paneling. They even pushed swords into gaps in the walls, trying to find anyone who might be hiding. When they finally left, Gerard came out of the tiny room. He said that if the search had continued much longer, the hiding place would have become his tomb. Nicholas Owen was captured in 1606. He was taken to the Tower of London and placed on the rack. But he refused to give them anything. He gave them no names and no locations. He died from the torture on March 2, 1606. In 1970, he was canonized. The old man in the rhyme who refused to say his prayers wasn't simply being difficult. He refused to pray in English because Catholic worship followed a different tradition under the Protestant prayer book. Left leg was slang for a Catholic. And threw him down the stairs referred to what could happen when soldiers discovered him. Nicholas Owen's hiding places are still being discovered today. The soldiers who searched for priests are long gone. But the rooms they were trying to find are still there.
Number 5. Three blind mice.
3 blind mice, 3 blind mice. See how they run, see how they run. They all run up to the farmer's wife who cut off their tails with a carving knife. Did you see such a sight in your life as 3 blind mice?
In 1609, Thomas Ravenscroft published a collection of rounds and catches. It included a song called 3 Blind Mice. But the version printed in that book was very different from the one children know today. There were no blind mice running from a farmer's wife. There were no tails being cut off with a carving knife. The original words were, "The miller and his merry old wife, she scraped her tripe, licked out the knife." That version remained in print for about 200 years. Nobody rewrote it. Nobody removed it. It simply remained there while people stopped paying attention to it. Then, in 1842, James Orchard Hallowell published a collection of nursery rhymes for children. He included 3 blind mice. By that point, the old tripe reference had disappeared. The knife had become a carving knife used to cut off the mice's tails. The miller and Dame Julian were gone as well. What remained was a much simpler story that children could understand. The rhyme had been changed, but there was no big announcement about it. Nobody explained that the original had been replaced. The 1609 version still exists. It was never destroyed. People simply stopped using it. The version children learn today is 233 years younger than the original. Most people who sing it have never heard the earlier version. And many people who teach it don't know it existed. Number 4. Georgie Porgy.
Georgie Porgy, pudding and pie, kissed the girls and made them cry.
George Villiers was born in 1592 in Leicestershire. His father died when George was only 13. He had little money, few connections, and no clear future. But he had one thing that people noticed: his appearance. In 1614, Villiers arrived at the court of King James I. Within a year, he had become a knight. 3 years later, he was an earl. 9 years after arriving at court, he had become the Duke of Buckingham. He was the only duke in England who was not part of the royal family. He received this rise because James I loved him. The king did not simply admire Villiers. He openly said that he loved him. In 1617, James stood before the Privy Council and said, "You may be sure that I love the Earl of Buckingham more than anyone else, and more than you who are here assembled. Christ had John, and I have George." The diarist Sir John Oglander watched their relationship and later wrote that he had never seen a husband show so much affection toward his wife as James showed toward his favorites, especially Buckingham. The letters between James and Villiers are still part of the historical record. James called Villiers his sweet child and wife. Villiers wrote back that he wanted to live only for the king's sake. In one letter, Villiers asked James whether he still loved him as much as he had at Farnham, where the head of the bed could not be found between the king and his dog. Villiers called James Dad. He signed letters, "Your humble slave and dog." During renovation work at Apethorpe Palace in 2004, workers discovered a secret passage connecting their bedchambers. Villiers then used his position to place members of his family into important offices across England. Few people could stop him because the king refused to listen to the criticism. The Bishop of Gloucester called Villiers the most handsome man in England. When James died in 1625, Villiers continued to hold great power under the new king. Charles I, he led a naval expedition against Spain in 1625, and it ended in disaster. Then he led another expedition against France in 1627, which went even worse. Parliament tried twice to remove him from power. Both times, Charles dissolved Parliament to protect him. Then, on August 23, 1628, a naval lieutenant named John Felton stabbed Villiers through the heart in a doorway in Portsmouth. When the news reached London, people celebrated in the streets. Poets wrote about Felton. Pamphlets described him as a hero. Villiers was buried in the Henry VII Chapel at Westminster Abbey. King James I was buried there too. Their graves are next to each other. The king who once told the Privy Council, "Christ had John, and I have George," and the man he was talking about ended up in the same chapel. That is where their story ended. Number 3. Oranges and lemons.
Oranges and lemons, say the bells of St. Clement's. You owe me 5 farthings, say the bells of St. Martin's. When will you pay me, say the bells of Old Bailey. When I grow rich, say the bells of Shoreditch.
St. Clement's. St. Martin's, Old Bailey, Shoreditch, Stepney, and Bow are all connected to the rhyme. But the important part isn't simply the bells. It is what happened along the route between these places. Condemned prisoners held inside Newgate Prison were taken through the streets of London by cart on their way to execution. Their route passed several churches. As the cart moved through the city, the church bells rang. The prisoners could hear each one. In 1605, a merchant tailor named John Dow gave money to the Church of St. Sepulchre without Newgate. The church stood directly opposite the prison. His donation was used to commission a handbell. The bellman's job was to walk to the condemned cells on the night before an execution. He would stand outside the door, ring the bell, and recite a verse. The verse warned the prisoners that they would die the next day. It told them to watch and pray because they would soon have to stand before God. It ended by asking God to have mercy on their souls when St. Sepulchre's bell rang in the morning. This happened at midnight, in darkness, through a closed door. And the practice continued for about 200 years. The bells mentioned. In the rhyme's Old Bailey section were the bells of St. Sepulchre. The candle that would light the way to bed was the bellman's candle, and the chopper referred to the executioner's axe. The executioner's axe from 1605 is still displayed inside St. Sepulchre without Newgate. It sits inside a glass case, and the church remains open to visitors. Children sang this rhyme for hundreds of years without knowing what those bells were connected to. Number 2. Rockabye Baby.
Rock-a-bye baby on a treetop. When the wind blows, the cradle will rock. If the bough breaks, the cradle will fall. But Mama will catch you, cradle and all.
The rhyme first appeared in print in a book called Mother Goose's Melody. The publisher included a footnote explaining what the rhyme supposedly meant. It said that the rhyme could serve as a warning to proud and ambitious people who climb too high and eventually fall. That footnote is the oldest surviving explanation connected to the rhyme. It wasn't meant as a sweet song about putting a baby to sleep. It was presented as a warning. On June 10, 1688, a boy named James Francis Edward was born in London. His father was King James II. His birth changed the political situation in England. James II had converted to Catholicism. For years, many English Protestants had expected his daughter Mary, who was Protestant, to inherit the throne. Then a son was born. The baby was Catholic, which meant that England could now have a Catholic heir. Rumors immediately began spreading. Some people claimed the baby wasn't really James's son. They said another baby had been secretly brought into the birthing room inside a warming pan so that a Catholic child could be presented as the heir. The story was false, but it spread because many people wanted to believe it. The alternative, a Catholic dynasty ruling England, was something they strongly opposed. 5 months later, William of Orange sailed from the Netherlands with an army. The wind that helped his fleet cross the English Channel became known in political pamphlets as the Protestant wind. James II's own officers began abandoning him. In December 1688, James fled to France. He never returned to the English throne. His son, James Francis Edward, spent the rest of his life in Rome. The Pope gave him a palace there. He could have claimed the English throne if he converted to the Church of England. But every time he was asked, he refused. He remained Catholic. That was the same faith that had helped lead to his father's removal from power. James Francis Edward would not abandon it simply to gain a crown. He died on January 1st, 1766, on New Year's Day. His body remained on display for 5 days before he was buried in the crypt of St. Peter's Basilica. 2 months after his death, the royal arms of England were removed from the door of his palace in Rome. History called him the Old Pretender. He called himself James III. The wind in the rhyme represents the fleet that came from the Netherlands. The bow represents the Stuart monarchy. The cradle represents the royal family. And Down Will Come Baby describes what happened to the royal line. The publisher had already given this interpretation in 1765. They called it a warning then. The book ended up in children's nurseries. Number 1. Ring Around the Rosie.
See.
Ring around the rosies, a pocket full of posies. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down.
Here is the story most people have heard about Ring Around the Rosie and the plague. According to the theory, the Rosie represents the rash caused by plague. The posies were supposedly herbs carried to cover the smell of death. The ashes represented dead bodies being burned. And we all fall down meant exactly what it seemed to mean. Many people today were taught this explanation as children. It sounds believable. It feels like the kind of dark story that could have been hidden inside a children's song. But there is a major problem with it. Peter and Iona. Opie were among the leading experts on nursery rhymes during the 20th century. In 1951, they examined the plague explanation and rejected it. They later wrote that they had heard the claim so many times that they were reluctant, even to leave their home. The rhyme was first printed in 1881. But the plague explanation wasn't actually published until 1961, when a man named James Lees included it in a book. That means the Opis rejected the explanation a full decade before the plague theory was even put into print. The myth survived. Anyway, folklorists instead connect the rhyme to dancing bands in Protestant Britain and America during the 19th century. Young people were not allowed to dance, so they created play parties. These were ring games that looked similar to dancing, but were not officially treated as dances. Ring Around the Rosie was one of those games. The falling down was a curtsy. That was the original purpose of the rhyme. It was a game that allowed young people to get around rules against dancing, yet millions of people eventually taught it to their children as a song about mass death. The reason is simple. The plague explanation sounds like the kind of hidden history people expect to find inside an innocent children's song, but the evidence does not support it. The Opis had already rejected the theory in 1951. The real evidence was there. Yet the story kept spreading. The rhyme is still taught today. The plague story is still repeated, and despite how often it is told, the basic facts behind the rhyme never changed.